Senator, it's Dagan McDowell. But as it stands, this bill that has been put together by the Republican leadership in the House and now the Senate, there's nothing that they could do to it that would make you vote for it. Is that safe to say?
This current bill in this process, I would not vote for. Okay. But what I would vote for is a bill that does a few simple things to make our tax code more competitive internationally, to reduce the corporate rate, and to encourage the reshoring of corporate profits held overseas and dedicating those funds to the middle class and to infrastructure. We've got temporary middle class tax cuts and permanent corporate cuts in this bill, and I'm not convinced that it won't significantly increase our deficits and debt, and I think that is a long-term problem. There's a number of Republican senators who agree, and they're trying to modify it by adding a trigger, which I'm concerned will be too complex of a mechanism that we won't actually enforce in the future.
How about putting a trigger in if it actually raises more revenue than people thought, a trigger to cut taxes 6 years out rather than raising taxes? Because, again, if they're looking at it glass half empty rather than glass half full. That was just an aside, Senator.
No, Senator, I mean, that's an important point from Dagan. I mean, the president has tweeted, funny to hear Democrats talking about the national debt when President Obama doubled it in only 8 years. Would you not recognize that growth is an aspect? And if the majority leader is right, 0.4% in 10 years will pay for this. Would you not recognize that growth is a factor and that CBO doesn't score for that?
Growth is absolutely what should be our shared goal. If we can increase the rate of growth of the American economy, it solves a whole lot of problems. So we should be angling towards a stronger pro-growth alignment in our tax code. Tax simplification, tax competitiveness, those will both advance growth in our economy. But I'm not persuaded that this overall tax plan is going to lead to enough growth to pay for itself. Right. And neither are several Republican senators. If we had had hearings on this bill, we'd have a better understanding of that. I'll remind you that CBO and JCT, the two bipartisan groups, the Congressional Budget Office and the Joint Committee on Taxation, haven't really had a time to study this in any detail because we're racing to meet a Christmas deadline. It's been 30 years since we've done comprehensive tax reform here in the Senate. Right. Why not take the time to understand what we're doing in an incredibly complicated bill?
You say you want hearings, but it's been 30 years, and we've been talking about tax reform for almost as much as that time. How come nothing was done under the President Obama years? I mean, finally, we're getting to a point where actually we're going to see some structural change here. And on the other point that you're making, you're talking about two things. You're saying, okay, I don't like the way the family tax credit, we want to have an expansion there. You want more middle-class tax cuts, and yet you're worried about the deficit. So which is it? Where does the money come from? Something's got to give. Do you feel like you're spending too much money on tax cuts, or do you feel like we're not spending enough? I don't understand, because you're making both points.
No, I'm not. Let me try and be more simple if I can. It is a very large, very complex bill that affects about $4 trillion in economic activity over the next decade. On the personal side is where there is a significant loss in future tax revenue. So some of the tax reductions at the highest rate and some of the ways that the treatment of pass-throughs will cost revenue to the federal government over a long time or reduce the tax burden on pass-throughs. I don't think that's been well enough understood, and that's where I think there's a significant risk of an increase in the deficit. There isn't enough of a middle-class tax cut in this bill. The president ran on a middle-class tax cut, and the latest analysis of this bill suggests that everyone making less than $75,000 in this country will end up paying more in taxes. But folks who make a great deal,
I don't think that's true.
Well, that is the last
analysis
analysis from JCT.
You're doubling the standard deduction. So you know the first $24,000, no tax at all. How could you say that $75,000 in income is going to pay higher taxes? It just doesn't. It's not in the numbers.
Well, that's not my opinion. That's what the Joint Committee on Taxation has said about this bill.
Senator, how many Democrats are in your camp that there's nothing that can be done to this bill that would cause them to vote for it?
Well, that's not the camp I'm in. I'm in a camp where I want to do bipartisan tax reform. I think we could get more than 60 votes for a bill that does simplification, that makes our corporate rate more competitive, that invests in infrastructure, and that delivers a real and permanent middle-class tax cut, not a temporary middle-class tax cut.
Look, the New York Times editorial board today is urging its readers to call lawmakers to oppose tax reform. We know what the lawmakers, the leadership on the Democratic side of this is doing. They say they don't want to vote for tax reform at all. You're saying you wanted hearings now, but where were you over the last 8 years? Where were you when this process was beginning?
Maria, you may not know my record. I participated in a dozen different meetings with the Finance Committee over the last 2 Congresses. I put out a public position paper on tax reform. This is something I've been active on.
Then
Jerry
you should
Moran,
be
a
heard.
conservative. Let me just finish.
Are you being heard?
Let me finish, please. Jerry Moran, conservative Republican from Kansas, and I are the co-chairs of the Competitiveness Caucus. We've had a series of public meetings and hearings, policy sessions on how to deal with competitiveness for our economy. I worked in manufacturing for 8 years before getting here. I'm as frustrated as you are that we haven't made real progress on a bipartisan basis on tax reform. My concern is that this is a very complicated bill, that once we truly understand its details, they will not be as positive as we hope. I wish we had more time to air it openly.
Yeah.
Under the last Congress, we did have a whole series of hearings on
Well,
this.
obviously, we want to get this right, Senator. All right, it's good to see you. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Senator Coons joining us there. We'll be